The sun was already climbing when Daniel pushed his small wooden boat into the swamp. The air was warm and heavy, and a thin layer of mist still floated above the dark green water. The only sounds around him were the buzzing of insects and the soft splashes of the paddle cutting through the still surface. It was the kind of place where time seemed to move slower, where everything felt distant from the rest of the world. Daniel had been exploring forgotten places for years. He wasn't famous, but online a small group of people followed his adventures. He had explored old factories, dried-out lakes, abandoned farmhouses, and ghost towns, but nothing he had seen before made him as curious as this swamp. He had heard the stories many times from locals in the small town nearby. They talked about a strange shape deep in the marshlands, something huge that didn't belong there. Some said it was an old ship. Others thought it was just a legend meant to scare people from going too far. But Daniel was not the kind of person who walked away from a mystery. He packed his camera, drone, a flashlight, a knife, and some food in a small backpack. He wanted to see it for himself, to prove whether the legend was true or not. The deeper he went, the thicker the swamp became. The water grew darker and slower. The trees stretched their long roots like twisted fingers, some dipping into the water, others hanging overhead. It felt like the forest itself was closing in around him. He moved carefully, using his paddle to push past patches of floating plants and tangled branches. Every now and then, he checked his compass and his GPS to make sure he was going in the right direction. There was no cell signal here. If something happened, no one would hear him. After about 2 hours, he stopped to rest. He pulled his phone out and sent his small drone into the air. The drone rose slowly, its little propellers buzzing. Daniel stared at the screen as the camera climbed higher, pushing past the tree canopy. The view was endless green and brown, water and trees stretching for miles. But then he saw something big. At first, it looked like a shadow under the water. But as the drone moved closer, the shape became clear. A long white structure, rusty and covered in green moss, was sitting in the middle of the swamp. His heart started to pound faster. It wasn't a shadow, it wasn't a legend, it was real. Daniel zoomed in and saw windows, metal, a railing. It looked like a massive ship, tilted slightly to one side, swallowed by nature. A cruise ship. He lowered the drone slowly, trying not to shake. He had found many abandoned places before, but nothing like this. A cruise ship in the middle of a swamp didn't make sense. There was no ocean anywhere close. How could something that big end up here? Daniel pulled the paddle back into the water and began to row again. The sun climbed higher, burning away the mist. The air grew hotter and heavier, but he didn't stop. He rowed faster now, guided by the direction of the drone footage. After another 30 minutes, the trees began to thin. The water widened into a shallow lagoon. And then he saw it with his own eyes. The ship rose out of the water like a sleeping giant. It was enormous, at least 10 stories tall. The white paint on its side had peeled away long ago, leaving behind a patchwork of rust and green moss. Vines climbed along the edges, wrapping around the metal like it was part of the forest. One side of the ship leaned slightly down into the swamp, as if it had been frozen mid-sinking. Daniel just sat there in his little boat, staring. The name of the ship was barely visible on the side, covered by layers of dirt and algae. A few faded letters peeked through, but not enough to read. The windows were dark, like hundreds of empty eyes watching him. He could feel the hairs on his arms stand up. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the weight of the moment. He was looking at something extraordinary, something lost to the world for decades. Slowly, Daniel brought the boat closer. The water around the ship was still and shallow. There was a faint smell of metal, mold, and something older, like trapped air from another time. A broken staircase led from the water up to a small platform near what used to be an entrance. It looked unstable, but it was his only way in. He tied the boat to a tree trunk sticking out of the water and tested the first step with his foot. It groaned under his weight, but it held. One careful step after another, Daniel climbed up. When he finally reached the platform, he turned around and looked at the swamp below. The boat was small, the trees silent, the water still. No one else was here. He pushed open a metal door. It creaked loudly, echoing through the hollow halls. Inside was a long corridor. Dust and dirt coated the floor. Ferns grew out of cracks. Old signs still hung on the walls, pointing to dining rooms, theaters, cabins. It was as if time had stopped. Daniel raised his flashlight and stepped in. The air inside was cooler but stale, like it hadn't moved in years. Broken chairs lay scattered on the floor. A few old suitcases sat in corners, covered in mud. The ceiling lights were dead, their glass cracked or missing. He walked slowly, every footstep echoing. It felt wrong to make noise here, like walking through someone else's memories. In one room he found what used to be a lobby. A large chandelier had fallen to the floor, its pieces scattered like broken ice. A grand staircase curved upward to the upper floors. It must have been beautiful once when people laughed and music played here. Daniel couldn't help but imagine what it must have been like. People arriving for their vacation, dressed in bright clothes, pulling luggage, talking excitedly. The ship must have been full of life back then. But now it was silent, frozen, swallowed by the swamp. He turned on his camera and began recording everything. He didn't talk much. His voice felt too loud. Instead, he let the camera capture the sound of dripping water and the soft wind moving through the broken windows. Deeper in the ship, he found a hallway lined with doors. Some were closed, others hanging open. Inside the cabins, beds still stood, covered in leaves and dirt. Old towels lay on the floor, stiff with age. One room had a children's toy on the bed, a small stuffed bear, its fur eaten away by time. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't ghosts that scared him. It was the way everything was just left here, as if everyone had walked away and never returned. He climbed a set of stairs that creaked under his feet. The second floor opened into what looked like a large dining area. Long tables stood in neat rows, their white tablecloths yellowed and torn. Plates and glasses still sat on the tables, some knocked over, some untouched. A chair lay on its side, as if someone had once jumped up in a hurry. He walked between the tables, shining his flashlight around. Nature had claimed the space. Vines hung from the ceiling like curtains. Small birds fluttered through broken windows. Daniel checked his watch. He had been inside for almost an hour already, and he had only explored a small part of the ship. He felt a mix of fear and excitement. This was a mystery unlike anything he had found before. He had to keep going. Before leaving the dining hall, he looked out through a cracked window. The swamp outside was quiet, green, endless. The ship was alone here, hidden for who knew how long. He went back to the corridor and found an elevator shaft with its doors jammed open. The elevator car was stuck halfway between floors. Rust covered every metal surface. He didn't dare to climb through it. Instead, he found another staircase and slowly moved down to what seemed to be the lower deck. Down here, the air felt heavier. Water had flooded part of the hallway, making the floor slick. Daniel stepped carefully, his boots splashing softly. A faded sign pointed to a storage area, another to a medical bay. The thought of going deeper made his stomach twist, but he pushed on. He wasn't ready to stop. He stopped for a moment, leaning against the wall, just listening. He expected silence, but somewhere deep in the ship, a drop of water hit metal in a slow rhythm. Plink, plink, plink. It was the only sound. He took a deep breath. He knew this was just the beginning. He hadn't even touched the lower rooms yet, and already the mystery felt bigger than anything he had uncovered before. As the sun started to dip outside, golden light slipped through the broken windows, painting the corridor in warm colors. Daniel decided to head back for the day and return tomorrow with more equipment. But before leaving, he turned and looked down the dark hallway one last time. Something about this place felt different. It wasn't just an abandoned ship. It felt like a secret waiting to be uncovered. He climbed back to the top deck, stepped onto the shaky platform, and slowly lowered himself into his boat. As he rowed away, the ship grew smaller behind him, swallowed by the trees and fog. He couldn't stop thinking about how it got there. A cruise ship, sitting in the middle of a swamp far away from any ocean. It didn't make sense, and that made it even more fascinating. Daniel knew he was going to come back. He had only scratched the surface of a mystery that had been buried for years. And somewhere deep inside that silent ship, something was waiting for him to find it. The next morning, Daniel woke up before the sun. He could still see the image of the ship in his head, that massive, silent structure hiding deep in the swamp. He had spent the night going over the footage from his camera. Every sound, every creak of the metal, every shadow had stayed with him. He didn't sleep much. This time he packed more carefully. A stronger flashlight, extra batteries, ropes, a mask to block the musty smell inside, a small hammer, and a little hand radio, even though he knew it wouldn't work that deep in the swamp. He wanted to be ready for anything. When he pushed the boat into the water again, the world was quiet. A soft fog hung over the surface. The trees were still, as if the swamp was holding its breath. As the paddle sliced through the water, Daniel could feel the same mix of excitement and uneasiness building in his chest. It took him a little less time to reach the ship this time. He knew the way now. When it appeared again through the mist, it looked even bigger than before. The light of early morning gave it a strange beauty, like a sleeping beast from another world. Daniel tied the boat to the same broken staircase and climbed up. The platform creaked beneath his weight, but it held. When he opened the metal door, the familiar stale air rushed out to meet him. It smelled like rust, wet wood, and something that had been trapped for a very long time. He switched on his flashlight and stepped inside. The hallway was exactly as he had left it. Nothing had moved. It was strange how quiet it was, as if the ship had been waiting for him to return. Daniel had decided to go deeper today. Yesterday he only explored the upper deck and the dining area, but now he wanted to reach the lower levels. He wanted answers. How did a cruise ship end up in the middle of a swamp? And why did it look like people had left in a hurry but never returned? As he walked through the corridor, the sound of his boots echoed softly. Sunlight pushed through broken windows, lighting up patches of the floor. But most of the hallway stayed in the shadows. He passed the lobby again, the chandelier still lying shattered on the ground. He stopped for a moment at the grand staircase and looked up at the empty balconies above. He thought about the people who must have once stood there, maybe waving at each other, laughing, taking pictures. That image made the silence feel even heavier. Daniel moved toward the elevator shaft he saw the day before. The doors were still jammed open. The car was stuck between floors, its cables groaning softly as the wind moved through the broken walls. He decided to avoid that and took the narrow staircase next to it. As he walked down, the air grew cooler and damper. He could smell the water below. The lower deck was darker, with only thin streams of sunlight leaking through small cracks and holes. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, his boots splashed into shallow water. The floor here was flooded. The walls were covered with moss and green streaks. Some signs hung crookedly, their letters faded. He wiped the dirt off one with his hand. It read storage to the left and medical to the right. He pointed his flashlight toward the storage area first. The hallway narrowed, the ceiling lower. He moved slowly, careful not to slip. On both sides were heavy metal doors, some slightly open. When he pushed the first door wider, it let out a sharp squeal. Inside was a long room filled with what looked like old luggage. Suitcases were stacked against the wall, some split open, their contents spilling out. Clothes, shoes, small travel bags, books. Everything was coated in a thin layer of green. It was as if people had left all their belongings behind in a single moment. Daniel crouched down and opened one of the suitcases. Inside were clothes neatly folded, untouched by animals or insects. A travel guide, a pair of sunglasses, and a photograph of a smiling family sat on top. It gave him a strange feeling. The people who owned these things had once been full of plans, ready for their trip, and then nothing. He stood up and walked deeper into the storage room. More luggage, more personal items. Everything seemed carefully placed, not thrown around like in a panic. That detail bothered him. If the ship had been evacuated in an emergency, wouldn't everything be a mess? Near the end of the room, he found something even stranger. Shelves lined with hundreds of small metal boxes, each labeled with faded tags. Some had names, others had numbers. He ran his hand over one of them. The boxes were sealed tight. He didn't try to open them, not yet. But the neat rows of metal containers made the room feel even more unsettling. Daniel backed out slowly and returned to the hallway. The sound of dripping water echoed around him. He turned toward the direction marked medical. The hallway here was narrower, darker. The floor was covered in water up to his ankles. When he pushed open the medical bay door, the smell hit him first. Not rot exactly, but old, stale air trapped for years. Inside, beds lined the walls. Rusty equipment lay scattered around. A few cabinets stood against the back wall, their glass cracked. Papers floated in the shallow water, their ink washed away. Daniel stepped carefully between the beds. Some still had thin blankets on them. On one of the walls, he noticed a large sign with the word quarantine, faintly visible beneath the grime. His heart started to beat a little faster. He didn't know what had happened here, but it didn't look like a simple evacuation anymore. Something bigger had gone on inside this ship. In the corner of the room, a door led to a small office. He pushed it open. Inside, a desk lay on its side, papers scattered across the floor. A few were still pinned to the corkboard above, their edges yellowed with time. He picked one up. It had faded writing and strange codes, maybe medical records or instructions, but most of the text was too damaged to read. On the desk, he found a logbook, its leather cover swollen from moisture. Carefully, he opened it. The first few pages were ruined, but further in, some words were still readable. It mentioned passenger numbers, medical checks, and something about isolation. The handwriting grew messier toward the last pages, like someone had been in a hurry. Daniel didn't understand everything, but he could tell this ship hadn't just been a place for vacations. Something serious had happened here. He tucked the logbook into his bag and took a deep breath. The air felt heavier now, like the ship itself was holding its breath. He decided to head to the upper decks for a bit of light. As he climbed the stairs, he passed by more hallways. In one of them, he found a door that looked different from the rest. It was thicker, made of metal and sealed with a heavy latch. A faded warning sign was barely visible on it, the paint almost completely gone. He tried the handle, but it wouldn't move. It was locked tight. His heart pounded again. Why would a cruise ship have a door like this deep inside? It wasn't a normal storage room. It felt more like something was being kept inside. Daniel ran his hand along the frame. The edges were rusted but strong. Whatever was behind this door had been locked away for a very long time. He stepped back and stared at it for a long moment. He didn't try to force it open, not yet. He wanted to think carefully before making any big moves. He also didn't want to damage anything that might give him clues later. Daniel climbed back to the upper deck where sunlight spilled in through the broken windows. The air felt a little lighter up here. He sat down near the grand staircase to rest for a moment. His boots were wet, his hands dirty, and his mind full of questions. He thought about the storage room, the untouched luggage, the medical bay, the sealed door. None of it added up. If this ship had been abandoned during a storm or accident, why was everything still in place? Why was there a quarantine sign inside a cruise ship meant for vacations? Daniel looked up at the high ceilings and the balconies above. This ship had once been a place of joy, of music and laughter. Now it was like a frozen moment in time, holding secrets it didn't want to share. He turned on his camera again and spoke softly, almost whispering. He didn't even know who he was talking to. Maybe the people who would watch this later, maybe just to himself. He said how strange it felt, how the air seemed to change as he went deeper. He said this was more than just an abandoned ship. This was something hidden, something meant to stay forgotten. After resting for a few minutes, he walked through the dining hall again. The plates were still there. The chairs hadn't moved. It was exactly as he had left it. That stillness felt eerie. He walked out onto the deck, the sun now shining bright overhead. He leaned against the rusty railing, looking out at the swamp. It was silent, peaceful, like nothing unusual was here. But he knew better now. As he packed his bag, Daniel knew he wasn't done. The locked door below was calling to him. He didn't know what was inside, but it was clear the answer to this mystery lay behind it. Tomorrow he would come back again, this time with the right tools to open it. And whatever he found, he was ready to face it. When he climbed down the staircase to his little boat, the sun was beginning to lower in the sky. He took one last look at the massive ship. The rusty metal reflected the light like a tired old giant watching him leave. He pushed the boat away from the platform and started to paddle back through the quiet swamp. The water rippled softly behind him. The deeper he went into the trees, the less he could see of the ship. It disappeared slowly, swallowed again by the green walls of the forest. But even after it vanished from sight, Daniel could still feel it. That silent, heavy presence, sitting alone in the swamp, waiting. The next day, Daniel stood on the edge of the dock, staring at the swamp. It was early morning again, and the air was still. Not a single leaf moved. The thick green water looked calm, but Daniel could feel the weight of the ship waiting for him out there. All night he had thought about the locked metal door in the lower deck. It wasn't just any door. It felt like the heart of the mystery. The untouched luggage, the quiet hallways, the medical bay with the quarantine sign. Everything pointed toward that sealed room. He knew that if he could get inside, he might finally understand what had happened to this ship so many years ago. He loaded his backpack carefully. Inside he packed a small crowbar, a hammer, extra rope, more batteries, and water. He also brought a small first aid kit just in case. As he pushed the boat into the swamp, a light breeze moved across the water, carrying with it that faint metallic smell he had noticed before. The journey to the ship felt shorter now, maybe because he knew exactly where he was going. The trees opened up slowly, and soon the massive cruise ship came into view, half hidden behind vines and mist. It looked quiet and cold, like it had been waiting for him to return. Daniel tied the boat to the same rusty staircase and climbed up carefully. The platform groaned under his weight just like it always did. When he opened the metal door, the stale air greeted him again. It no longer surprised him, but it still sent a chill down his back. He turned on his flashlight and walked down the hallway, passing the lobby, the broken chandelier, and the grand staircase. He didn't stop anywhere this time. His goal was clear. He walked down the narrow staircase to the lower deck. The air down here always felt heavier, as if the walls were holding their breath. His boots splashed in the shallow water, echoing softly through the empty corridors. When he reached the thick metal door, he stopped. It looked exactly as it had before. Rust covered the edges, but the metal was still strong. The latch was old, but not broken. A faint symbol on the door had almost disappeared with time, but Daniel could still make out a triangle and a faded warning sign. He put his hand on the cold surface and took a deep breath. Then he reached into his bag and pulled out the crowbar. He slid the metal end under the latch and pushed. It didn't move at first. The sound of the metal scraping echoed through the hallway. He tried again, this time with more force. The latch groaned but held tight. Daniel wiped the sweat from his forehead. The air in the hallway was hot and still. He braced his foot against the wall, gripped the crowbar tightly, and gave it one hard push. This time the latch snapped free with a loud crack. The sound echoed down the corridor like a shout. For a moment he just stood there, breathing heavily. He reached for the door handle. It was stiff but not locked anymore. Slowly he pulled it open. A gust of cold air rushed out, hitting him in the face. It smelled different from the rest of the ship, sharper, like something had been sealed away for a long time. The room beyond was dark. His flashlight beam cut through the air, lighting up the walls inside. Daniel stepped forward carefully. The floor was dry here, unlike the hallway. That alone felt strange. He expected water everywhere. The room was bigger than he imagined. Metal shelves lined the walls. Each shelf was filled with rows of boxes, suitcases, and sealed containers. It was like a storage room, but it didn't feel like the other one he had seen before. This one was too organized, too deliberate. Daniel walked slowly, reading the faded labels on the boxes. Some had names. Some had dates. Others had numbers. Everything looked like it had been carefully stored, not abandoned in a rush. He knelt to open one of the suitcases. Inside were personal belongings, clothes, shoes, a small journal wrapped in plastic. Everything was dry and clean, preserved in a way that didn't match the rest of the ship. That made him pause. If the ship had been lost for decades, how could these things look untouched? He walked farther into the room. At the back, there was a large metal cabinet. It was different from the rest, with a lock hanging loose. He opened it slowly. Inside were hundreds of passports stacked in neat piles. Old identification cards, papers, even photographs. Daniel picked up one of the passports and flipped it open. The picture showed a smiling woman, her hair pulled back neatly. The stamp on the page was from 1993. His heart began to beat faster. He wasn't holding just old junk. He was holding a piece of the ship's history, a piece of the people who had once stood on this deck, laughed in the dining room, slept in the cabins. He set the passport down carefully and turned around, shining the flashlight across the room again. That's when he saw another door at the far end. It was smaller, not as thick as the one he had forced open, but it was locked with a simple handle. He approached it slowly, feeling a quiet pressure in his chest. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the sense that he was about to uncover something big. He twisted the handle. It moved easily this time. The door opened with a low creak, revealing a narrow passage. The air inside was cooler, almost cold. Daniel stepped through, his flashlight beam shaking slightly as his heartbeat picked up. The passage led to a small room with a metal table in the center. Papers were scattered on the floor. On the wall, a faded map of the world hung crookedly. There were strange markings on the map. Circles drawn around specific places connected with red lines. Next to the map was a clipboard still hanging on a nail. Daniel lifted it and brushed off the dust. The paper was yellowed and faded, but he could make out a few words. There were references to passenger records and containment. That word made his stomach tighten. Containment. Why would a cruise ship need something like that? He walked to a small metal cabinet in the corner and opened it. Inside were empty vials, some old medical forms, and a few sealed envelopes. He didn't open the envelopes right away. Instead, he stood there for a moment, listening. The ship was completely silent. Even the dripping water from the hallway outside sounded far away. Daniel carefully picked up one of the envelopes. It had a symbol on it that matched the faint marking on the big door. He slid it into his bag to read later, somewhere safer. He didn't know what it contained, but he knew it was important. When he turned around to leave the small room, his flashlight passed over something he hadn't noticed before. A message scratched into the metal wall beside the map. The letters were rough, uneven, like someone had carved them in a hurry. He leaned closer. The words were simple, but they made his skin crawl. It said, "We didn't leave. We were left." Daniel stared at it for a long moment, the sound of his heartbeat loud in his ears. He didn't know who wrote it or when, but it felt real. It felt like someone had been trapped here. He slowly backed out of the passage and into the main storage room again. The rows of suitcases and boxes now felt different. Not just abandoned things, but reminders of real people who might have never made it out. As he stepped back into the hallway, the warm, swampy air hit him again. It felt almost heavy after being in that cold, sealed room. He closed the big metal door behind him, but didn't latch it. Something told him he might need to go back. Daniel climbed the stairs to the upper deck, but this time he wasn't just curious. He was unsettled. He had found real evidence that something serious had happened on this ship. It wasn't just a ghost story or a strange legend anymore. He walked through the grand dining hall again. The vines hanging from the ceiling swayed softly in the breeze. He stopped at one of the tables and ran his hand across the surface. Dust covered everything, but in the silence of the ship, the smallest touch felt loud. He sat down on one of the chairs and let out a slow breath. The passport, the message on the wall, the storage room, everything pointed to something bigger. The ship hadn't been lost in a storm. It hadn't just drifted into the swamp. Something had happened here that someone had tried to hide. Daniel pulled out his camera and began to talk softly, explaining everything he had seen. His voice was low, serious, not excited like usual. He said what he found in the sealed room. He showed the shelves, the passports, the message carved into the wall. He didn't know yet what it all meant, but the story was growing darker, layer by layer. The sun was beginning to lower outside, and the orange light spilled through the broken windows, making the shadows inside the ship longer. Daniel knew he couldn't stay much longer that day. It was too dangerous to be deep in the swamp at night. He packed his things carefully, making sure the envelope and the passport were safe in his bag. As he walked out onto the deck, he turned to look at the quiet hallway one last time. He could almost feel the weight of the past pressing against the walls. As he climbed down the staircase to his boat, the swamp air wrapped around him. The ship looked peaceful from the outside, but now he knew that peace was a lie. It was holding a secret, a big one. As the boat drifted away, Daniel turned to look at the ship until it disappeared behind the trees. He had found a piece of the puzzle, but he knew it wasn't the whole picture. The message on the wall echoed in his head again. We didn't leave. We were left. He didn't know who those people were or why they had been left behind. But now, more than ever, he was determined to find out. The air inside the lower deck felt different. It was colder, heavier, and the silence seemed to press down like an invisible weight. The explorer paused for a moment at the top of the narrow staircase, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. It wasn't the wind or the sound of water anymore. It was just quiet. Too quiet. He had already spent hours moving through the ship, exploring room after room, but this part felt untouched. Unlike the dining hall or the upper cabins, the floor here had no muddy footprints or fallen vines. It was as if no one had stepped into this place for years, maybe decades. The light from his flashlight fell on a thick metal door at the end of the corridor. It stood apart from the others, no cabin number, no sign, just smooth rusted steel. A heavy lock dangled at the side, broken, but still hanging there like someone had once wanted to make sure nobody came in. The explorer moved closer, feeling the cold metal against his fingertips. It was damp and rough, and he could smell something stale in the air, like old paper and closed spaces. He tried pushing the door, but it wouldn't budge at first. Years of being stuck in the swamp had sealed it shut. He pressed his shoulder against it and pushed harder, until it let out a long, slow creak. The sound echoed through the hallway like a deep sigh. He stepped inside carefully, unsure what he was about to find. The room was larger than he expected. His light swept across metal shelves lined up against the walls. At first, it looked like some kind of storage area. Then, as the beam passed over the shelves, he froze. On every shelf sat boxes, small bags, and personal items, wallets, watches, jewelry, glasses, cameras, even folded clothes. Everything was neatly arranged, almost as if someone had taken the time to place each thing in a specific order. It didn't look like a place where people rushed out in panic. It looked like everything had been collected. He picked up a small wallet, wiped away the thin layer of dust, and opened it. Inside was an old photograph of a family, smiling on what looked like the deck of a cruise ship. He turned the wallet over and saw a faded ID card tucked into one of the slots. The date printed on it matched the year the ship disappeared. A chill ran down his back. He walked along the shelves slowly, shining his flashlight over the endless rows of forgotten belongings. Some of the jewelry still sparkled faintly beneath the dust. Some of the clothes still carried the shape of the people who once wore them. It felt like walking into a time capsule. The deeper he went into the room, the more items he found. There were children's toys, notebooks, and even passports carefully stacked together. He picked one up and flipped through the pages. The stamps were from countries around the world, places these passengers might have visited before this journey. But what unsettled him most was that there were no signs of chaos. Usually, in places where people had fled, you would expect scattered objects or broken things. But here everything was perfectly in place. Almost too perfect. On the far side of the room, his light caught something different. A second door. It was smaller, with a round handle like the kind used on secure storage rooms. A faded red sign above it was barely visible. The letters were worn down, but he could still make out the word, restricted. He hesitated. The first door had been tough enough to open, and this one looked even stronger. But curiosity was stronger than fear now. He had come too far to turn back. He wrapped his hand around the cold handle and gave it a twist. It resisted at first, but then turned with a stiff, rusty sound. The door opened just wide enough for him to slip through. Inside, the air was even colder. It smelled faintly metallic, mixed with something he couldn't quite name. His flashlight revealed a narrow room with cabinets along the walls and a set of metal tables in the center. Strange symbols were painted faintly on the walls. They weren't decorative, they looked official. On the tables were rows of old medical containers, all tightly sealed. Labels, though faded, could still be read. They had numbers and warning symbols on them. The explorer stepped closer and ran his hand along the cool surface of one of the containers. It was heavier than he expected. He noticed something else. In one corner of the room was a stack of bright orange emergency rafts. They were still folded neatly, never opened, never used. That detail hit him harder than anything else. If this ship had been in an emergency, why were the rafts untouched? Why hadn't anyone tried to escape? He knelt down beside the rafts and inspected them carefully. Each one had a date printed on it, and they all matched the year the ship had vanished. Dust covered their surfaces, but the straps were still tightly secured. He moved back to the medical containers and crouched to see the lower shelves. There were logs and papers, carefully wrapped in plastic sleeves. He pulled one out and held it up to the light. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was still readable. It was a list of passenger names. Next to each name was a set of numbers, and next to some of those numbers were short notes written in hurried strokes. The handwriting became more uneven as he moved down the list, as if whoever had written it had been under pressure. He felt his heartbeat getting louder. None of this felt like ordinary ship storage. It felt like something that had been hidden away, something no one was supposed to find. He checked another paper. It wasn't a list, but a short report. Words like containment, quarantine, and classified appeared again and again. The more he read, the more uneasy he felt. He carefully placed the paper back where he found it and turned his light around the room again. That was when he saw the markings on the floor. They were faint but clear enough to make out. Someone had drawn lines and circles on the ground, marking areas as if this room had once been used for controlled operations. The ship wasn't just abandoned. It had been shut down, on purpose. He leaned back against the wall for a moment, trying to make sense of it all. People had clearly been on this ship. They had packed their things, they had passports, they had names. But where did they all go? The sound of dripping water outside the room reminded him how deep he was inside this forgotten vessel. The swamp was silent now, the world outside distant and still. He was alone with decades of unanswered questions. He decided to document everything carefully. He lifted his camera, which he had kept slung around his neck the whole time, and started, recording the shelves, the belongings, the containers, and the papers. He spoke quietly, almost whispering, not because anyone could hear him, but because the air in that room made it impossible to speak loudly. "This wasn't an accident," he said softly into the microphone. "Someone locked this place up. Someone wanted it to stay hidden." He walked slowly to the back of the room, where another small cabinet was tucked into the corner. It was older than the rest, its wooden surface warped from years of moisture. He pulled the door open carefully. Inside were a few small metal boxes, each sealed shut. He picked one up, feeling its weight. There were no labels this time, just a series of numbers etched into the lid. He set the box down gently and opened another one. It was empty, except for a single folded sheet of paper. The message on it was short. Just a few words scribbled in faded ink. "Do not open, do not move, leave everything." He stared at the note for a long time. It wasn't the kind of message left behind by panicked passengers. It was the kind of message written by someone following orders, someone who knew what was happening. The explorer's pulse quickened. The pieces were starting to connect in strange and unsettling ways. Personal belongings carefully stored, emergency rafts untouched, quarantine markings on the walls, official reports hidden away, and now a note warning not to disturb anything. He suddenly understood why this room had been locked. This wasn't just the story of a missing ship. It was something bigger, something that someone had wanted to bury forever in the quiet of the swamp. Still holding the note, he took a deep breath and turned off the flashlight for a second. The darkness wrapped around him completely, thick and silent. Then he clicked the light back on and exhaled slowly. He knew he couldn't stop here. There was still more to uncover, and he had to keep going, even if it meant going deeper into the shadows of this strange vessel. He placed the note carefully in his pocket, secured his camera, and stepped back into the hallway. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud. The quiet returned, and the swamp seemed to hold its breath once again. He had found what was inside the locked room. But whatever this was, it was only the beginning of a much bigger story.